The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the neatly kept suburban neighborhood, its golden hue painting the pristine white fences and manicured lawns in a deceptive warmth. The quiet hum of daily life carried through the streets, birds chirping, the distant sound of children laughing, the occasional passing car. It was a kind of neighborhood where everything seemed perfect on the surface, but underneath there were unspoken rules and silent judgments. David Carter parked his black pickup truck in front of his new home, exhaling deeply as he cut the engine. A former software engineer turned independent contractor, David had finally saved enough to purchase this house, a place he could truly call his own. With its spacious backyard and a modest pool, it was everything he had worked toward for years. Today, he was installing a smart lock on his pool gate, ensuring an extra layer of security and convenience. As he stepped out, he adjusted his tool belt and wiped the sweat from his brow. At 6 feet tall with an athletic build, David carried himself with quiet confidence. His dark brown skin glistened slightly under the sun, and his sharp eyes scanned the area before he grabbed his toolbox. He had learned long ago to be aware of his surroundings, especially in neighborhoods like this, where looks lingered a little longer, where every action felt observed. A few houses down, a woman in her mid-50s, blonde with an almost artificial sharpness to her features, stood with her arms crossed, watching him. Karen Whitmore, self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, had lived in this cul-de-sac for over 2 decades, priding herself on maintaining its so-called standards. Her eyes narrowed as she watched David approach the pool gate, tools in hand. He felt her gaze before he saw her, that piercing, scrutinizing stare he had felt it many times before. As he knelt down to begin his work, he heard the unmistakable sound of a throat clearing. He sighed internally. "Here we go." "Excuse me." Karen's voice was clipped, laced with underlying hostility. "Can I help you?" David looked up from his work and forced a polite smile. "No, ma'am. Just installing a smart lock on my pool gate." Karen's lips pursed as she eyed him skeptically. "Your pool gate?" "Yes, ma'am. This is my house," he said, gesturing toward the property behind him. Her eyes flickered with something. Surprise, maybe even irritation. She had clearly assumed he was a worker, not the homeowner. "Well," she sniffed, "I don't recall seeing a notice about any installations. We usually like to keep an eye on renovations to ensure they align with the neighborhood's aesthetic." David exhaled slowly, his patience already being tested. "It's just a lock, ma'am, not a renovation." Karen tilted her head. "Still, I think I'll have to check with the HOA about this." David simply nodded and returned to his work. He knew the type. People who felt entitled to question his presence, to assert authority where none was needed. But he had learned not to let it get to him. Not yet. Character's inner struggle. As David tightened the screws on the lock, his hands worked with practiced ease. But his mind churned. It was always the same story. Different location, same experience. Being questioned in a store, being asked if he was lost in certain neighborhoods, the double glances whenever he entered a space where he supposedly didn't belong. He had spent his entire life navigating these microaggressions, learning when to push back and when to stay silent. But today, as he crouched by his own pool gate in his own backyard, being treated like an intruder, something inside him clenched. Was this what homeownership meant? Defending his right to exist in his own space? He glanced back at Karen, who was now on her phone, her expression one of exaggerated concern. Calling the HOA? Or something more? His jaw tightened. He had worked too hard to let someone like her make him feel like he didn't belong. The irony wasn't lost on him. The smart lock he was installing wasn't just for security. It was for peace of mind. But what lock could keep out people like Karen, who saw him as a problem simply because he existed? The distant wail of sirens pulled him from his thoughts. His chest tightened as he stood up, already knowing what was coming. Karen wasn't calling the HOA. She had called the police. The screen door of the pristine White House creaked open, and out stepped Karen Whitmore. Shoulders squared, mouth set in a firm line, eyes narrowed in disapproval. Everything about her screamed control. The sharp press slacks, the manicured nails tapping impatiently against her crossed arms, and the way she positioned herself just at the edge of her property line, as if she were standing guard over some sacred ground. Karen had lived in this neighborhood for over a decade, and she made sure everyone knew it. The HOA committee practically bent to her will. Her words carried weight at every town hall meeting, and she had a way of inserting herself into situations that didn't concern her, especially when it came to keeping the neighborhood's integrity intact. Today, her target was Elijah Hayes. Elijah had lived in the neighborhood for only a few months, and Karen had made it clear from day one that she didn't think he belonged. He wasn't loud, he wasn't disrespectful. Quite the opposite. He kept his property maintained better than half the residents on the street. But to Karen, he was an outsider. And an outsider making changes to his home, especially adding what she considered unnecessary smart technology to his pool gate, was simply unacceptable. Initial conflict scene. Elijah was crouched near the gate, securing the last screws on the new smart lock. He worked methodically, checking the alignment, ensuring the keypad was set up correctly. This wasn't just for convenience. It was for security. As a former engineer, he valued efficiency, and as a homeowner, he valued peace of mind. Just as he tightened the final bolt, a shadow loomed over him. "Excuse me." Karen's voice cut through the air, sharp and dripping with condescension. Elijah exhaled slowly before turning his head upward to meet her gaze. Her arms were still crossed, her chin slightly lifted, an unspoken challenge in her stance. "Yes," he said evenly. Karen scoffed, looking him up and down as if sizing him up. "I couldn't help but notice you making some modifications. You do realize there are regulations about the aesthetics of this community, don't you?" Elijah stood, brushing the dust off his jeans. "I checked with the HOA guidelines. There's nothing against upgrading security features." Karen's lips pursed. "Maybe not explicitly, but around here, we have a certain expectation of how things are maintained. It doesn't blend with the community aesthetic." He knew what she meant. It wasn't about the lock. It was about him. "The lock is barely visible unless you're looking for it," he pointed out, voice calm. Karen took a step closer, voice lowering slightly. "It's not just a lock, Elijah. It's everything. I see how you come and go, keeping to yourself, not really engaging with the community." Ah, there it was. Elijah had felt the stares since he moved in, the polite but stiff smiles, the over-explained neighborhood rules, the way certain people, Karen, always seemed to have a problem with the way he did anything. "I keep to myself because I value my peace," Elijah replied, measured. "Is that a problem?" Karen let out a breathy chuckle, shaking her head. "You know, I think we just got off on the wrong foot. I'm just looking out for our neighborhood. I mean, some of us have been here for years, and we don't want things to change too much, you understand?" Elijah understood perfectly. "Right. Well, if you have a problem, feel free to take it up with the HOA," he said, turning back to his work. Karen's eyes darkened at the dismissal. She wasn't used to being brushed off. "I just might," she said, and with that, she turned sharply on her heel and strode back toward her house, but not before casting one last disapproving glance at the lock. Building empathy. Elijah let out a slow breath as he watched her walk away. He had been here before. Different places, different faces, but the same message. You don't belong here. It would have been easy to snap back, to argue, to let her bait him into a confrontation. But what would that prove? He had fought battles much tougher than this one. So, instead of wasting his energy, he simply turned back to his lock, testing it one last time before heading inside. Inside, he sat on his couch, staring out the window, watching Karen still pacing on her porch, already on the phone, probably with the HOA, maybe even the police. He had a feeling she wasn't done yet, and neither was he. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over Elijah's neatly kept yard. Inside his home, the soft glow of multiple monitors flickered against his face as he typed swiftly. His fingers moved with the kind of precision that came from years of practice. Lines of code scrolled across the screen. His own custom security system, one that would integrate seamlessly with the smart lock on his pool gate. But this wasn't just about keeping unwanted visitors out. This was about control. He leaned back, stretching his shoulders. If Karen wanted to play games, she had no idea who she was up against. On the corner of his desk sat a framed certificate, his name printed boldly above the title. Department of Cyber Defense, Security Systems Specialist. A subtle reminder of the world he had once been a part of, a world where he had built encryption systems strong enough to keep entire government agencies safe. He never boasted about his work, never felt the need to, but if Karen pushed him far enough, she'd soon realize she had underestimated the wrong man. Escalating encounters. Karen wasn't the type to let things go. The next morning, Elijah found a neatly folded letter taped to his front door. Homeowners Association notice. Unauthorized modifications must be removed immediately. He let out a short laugh. That was fast. Not even 24 hours had passed, and Karen had already set her plan in motion. Later that day, as Elijah was mowing his lawn, Karen approached once more, this time with another HOA member, Mr. Billings, an older man who looked just as sour as she did. "Elijah," Karen greeted, voice dripping with faux politeness. "We need to discuss your installation." Elijah shut off the mower, wiping sweat from his brow. "What about it?" Billings cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "It appears that your smart lock is not in line with the historical integrity of the neighborhood." Elijah arched a brow. Historical integrity? The houses in this neighborhood were built in the early 2000s. What history are we talking about? Karen's lips thinned. The point is, we can't allow random modifications without proper approval. Elijah crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. "So, I assume every other homeowner who installed security cameras, motion sensors, or even a keypad lock had to go through an approval process too?" A beat of silence. Karen's fingers twitched at her side. She hadn't expected pushback. "Well," she began, "most of them have lived here long enough to understand what's appropriate. And frankly, you're still adjusting." There was again that unspoken message. "I see," Elijah said slowly. He held her gaze, a knowing glint in his eyes. "I'll be sure to look into the HOA bylaws to verify that. And if necessary, I'll speak directly to the HOA board myself." Karen's jaw clenched. "I'd hate for this to become difficult for you," she said, voice dropping slightly. Elijah smiled. "Difficult? No, I don't think so. I'm actually very good at handling complications." Karen didn't like that answer, and Elijah could see it. She huffed, turning sharply and stalking off with Billings trailing behind her. Elijah exhaled through his nose, watching them retreat. He wasn't just dealing with nosy neighbors. This was something deeper, something personal. And something told him Karen wasn't done. Cliffhangers. That night, Elijah was reviewing his security footage when something caught his eye, a flicker of movement. He rewound the clip, narrowing his eyes. The footage showed Karen walking past his property around midnight, lingering by his pool gate. Her hands moved, checking the lock, testing it. Elijah leaned back in his chair, pressing his lips together. She was looking for something. Or worse, she was planning something. He glanced toward the window, where the faint glow of Karen's porch light burned across the street. Whatever she was up to, she had no idea she was being watched. Elijah's fingers hovered over his keyboard. With a few quick keystrokes, he pulled up a different program, one that would alert him the second anyone tampered with his property. He wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. Let her think she had the upper hand. For now. The next morning, Elijah walked into a sleek, glass-walled office downtown. Unlike the quiet suburb where Karen played queen of the neighborhood, this was his domain. A security firm's logo gleamed behind the front desk, and multiple screens displayed live footage of various properties under surveillance. The employees, many in crisp, button-down shirts, nodded in respect as he passed. "Morning, boss," one of the junior analysts greeted. Elijah nodded back. Heading straight to the control center, multiple monitors displayed cybersecurity analytics, live feeds, and encrypted reports. His team had been working on a new security prototype, one designed for high-profile clients. He typed in a few commands, pulling up his own home security network. His eyes flickered over Karen's midnight snooping attempt. She really had no idea who she was messing with. A colleague leaned over his shoulder. "Something interesting?" Elijah smirked. "Just a little case study. Neighborhood security concerns." With a few keystrokes, he pulled up the legal documents for his homeowners association. Buried in the fine print was a loophole, one that would allow him to not only keep his smart lock, but also force a full security audit on the neighborhood. Karen thought she was above the rules. Elijah was about to remind her how rules really worked. Resilience under pressure. Later that evening, as Elijah arrived home, he found another HOA notice taped to his door. This one was bolder, more aggressive. "Final warning. Unauthorized modifications must be removed immediately." His jaw tightened. Karen wasn't just trying to enforce the rules. She was trying to push him out. Across the street, she stood on her porch, arms folded, watching him. A silent challenge. Elijah took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of frustration pressing down on him, but he refused to give in to it. He had been through worse than a petty suburban tyrant. Instead of reacting, he pulled out his phone and called the HOA board directly. "Hello, this is Elijah Carter. I need to schedule a formal review of the HOA security policies. There's been some selective enforcement, and I'd like to present a case for neighborhood-wide improvements." Karen's smirk faltered as she saw him on the phone. She knew he wasn't backing down. Building audience expectation. That night, Elijah sat at his desk, reviewing footage from his smart lock system. And then he saw it. Karen, again. But this time, she wasn't alone. She had brought a contractor, someone fiddling with the lock, testing its durability. Elijah exhaled slowly. His fingers tapped against the desk. It was time. With a few precise clicks, he forwarded the footage to his lawyer, then to a contact at the local news station. Tomorrow was going to be a very bad day for Karen. The following afternoon, the Neighborhood Homeowners Association gathered at the community center for an emergency meeting. The air buzzed with whispered conversations. People had heard murmurs of a security concern, but no one knew the details. Karen, dressed in her signature power red blazer, stood at the front, an air of confidence radiating from her. She had worked hard to build her influence in the HOA, and today she planned to shut down Elijah's so-called smart lock nonsense for good. Elijah, calm and composed, took a seat near the front. He had spent years in high-stakes boardrooms, dealing with billion-dollar security contracts. This was child's play. Karen cleared her throat. "Thank you all for coming. We are here today to discuss a blatant violation of our neighborhood's aesthetic and safety standards. Mr. Carter here has refused to comply with our HOA's regulations by installing unauthorized security modifications to his property." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Karen turned to Elijah, smiling with faux sympathy. "Now, Elijah, I know you're new here, but we have rules for a reason. Security systems like yours can make people uncomfortable." Elijah leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Uncomfortable? Or just uncomfortable for you?" Karen's smile twitched. "This isn't personal. We just don't want unnecessary complications." Elijah chuckled. "Unnecessary complications? Like someone tampered with my property?" A hush fell over the room. Karen's expression stiffened. Elijah reached into his briefcase and pulled out a tablet. He tapped the screen, and the footage from a security system projected onto the community center's large display. Karen's face drained of color. There she was, caught on camera, trespassing, inspecting his lock, bringing a contractor to mess with it. Gasps echoed through the room. Elijah's voice was smooth, unbothered. "Now, Imagine my surprise when I checked my security feed and found Karen personally ensuring my home was, well, less secure. The HOA members exchanged looks of shock. One man in the crowd muttered, "That's a huge violation, Karen." Another woman whispered, "Why would she be messing with his house?" Karen opened her mouth, but Elijah wasn't finished. With another tap, he pulled up an official letter from his attorney, blown up for the entire room to see. Under HOA Bylaw 14.3, any member who is found to be deliberately tampering with another resident's property in an unauthorized manner is subject to immediate review and possible removal from the HOA board. Karen froze. Elijah smiled coolly. "Oh, and since my security system operates under the same regulations as those used for federal buildings, tamper with it without authorization is technically a felony, but I'm sure that's just a little oversight on your part, right?" The entire room exploded into whispers. Karen's perfectly curated dominance was shattering before her eyes. Power shift. Her lips parted, but for the first time, she had nothing to say. The HOA president, a no-nonsense man named Richard, sighed and folded his arms. "Karen, is this true?" She stammered. I was just ensuring neighborhood safety. I thought." Richard shook his head. "You thought you were above the rules." Elijah leaned back in his chair, utterly relaxed. "Funny, isn't it?" he mused. "You spent all this time trying to paint me as a threat, when in reality, you were the one breaking the law." Karen turned to the crowd desperately. "You all know me. I've done so much for this neighborhood." But the damage was done. The same neighbors who once nodded along to her speeches now avoided her gaze. Richard turned to Elijah. "We'll handle this immediately. I'll be recommending Karen's removal from the board. And as for your security system," he glanced at the footage again and shook his head, "you clearly know what you're doing. If anything, we should have more people updating their security, not fewer." Karen clenched her fists, her face burning red. Elijah stood, buttoned his jacket, and smirked. Checkmate. Consequences for the antagonist. Karen's world collapsed overnight. The HOA wasted no time convening an official vote. By the following week, the motion to remove her from the board passed with an overwhelming majority. She went from the community's self-proclaimed guardian to a disgraced outcast. Her influence shattered beyond repair. But that was just the beginning. After the footage of her tampering with Elijah's property circulated among the residents, her reputation took a deeper nosedive. Some neighbors, especially those who had once sided with her, now avoided her completely, ashamed of how easily they had followed her lead. Others were less subtle, whispering about her whenever she walked by, coldly ignoring her attempts to regain control of the narrative. One morning, Karen found a notice taped to her front door. It wasn't from the HOA, it was from her employer. Turns out, corporations don't like hiring people caught committing felonies on camera. A swift internal review led to her immediate termination, leaving her scrambling for a way to salvage what was left of her crumbling image. She tried to fight back, of course. She filed complaints, appeals, and even a lawsuit against the HOA, claiming she had been unfairly targeted. But when the case went to mediation, Elijah had one final trump card, a counter lawsuit for trespassing, defamation, and unlawful tampering with private property. The moment her lawyer saw Elijah's full credentials, his status as a top security consultant for major federal and corporate institutions, he all but begged her to settle. By the end of it all, Karen was forced to pay damages, publicly apologize, and quietly move out of the neighborhood she once ruled. Triumphant close. Elijah, on the other hand, had no trouble settling in. After the HOA reversed its stance on security upgrades, other residents actually started reaching out to him for advice. "Hey, Elijah, I was thinking about installing some cameras. Any recommendations?" "Man, I had no idea you were a pro at this. Wish we knew sooner." For the first time, the same people who had once doubted his presence now valued his expertise. One evening, as he secured the final adjustments to his smart gate, a few neighbors gathered outside, watching in curiosity. "All right," Elijah said, stepping back. "Who's next?" A chuckle rippled through the group. Maybe this neighborhood wasn't so bad after all. Final reflection. Later that night, Elijah stood on his porch, sipping a cold drink and watching the streetlights flicker on. The past few weeks have been exhausting, frustrating, and downright absurd at times. But in the end, truth had won. This wasn't just about a smart lock. It was about perception, respect, and resilience. People like Karen had spent years believing they could get away with their arrogance, until they met someone who refused to back down. Elijah smirked to himself, taking one last sip before heading inside. Some battles don't need fists or anger, just patience, proof, and the perfect checkmate.